I'm a guard stationed at a secret government prison, Part 2, written by Mr. Outlaw. This place sure does give you the creeps, doesn't it? I couldn't disagree with Sandhu's assessment of the bizarre room that we found ourselves in. The monitors only illuminated the area up until a certain point. However, I couldn't see any walls, which meant that the place had to be bigger than what could be seen, either by a little or a lot. We couldn't know unless we decided to venture further into the darkness. Neither of us took that initiative though, keeping it a mystery. Still, it didn't feel like anybody was in there with us, so we allowed ourselves to relax a bit. I took the first shift, lying back in the chair and focusing on the monitor that I deemed most interesting at that moment. Wirehead versus Luz. Who was I rooting for? None of them, really. Nevertheless, I was morbidly eager to see these two horrific titans square off. Among us guards, we'd created an unofficial tier system, ranking each respective void in terms of the estimated threat that they posed in comparison to each other. The tiers went as such: Tornado, which was the weakest, then Tsunami, then Hurricane, which was the middle, then Earthquake, and finally Asteroid, highest imminent death, get out. They were also divided into subdivisions, high, low, mid, etc. With that said, Luz was around a high tornado, while Wirehead was around a mid tsunami. A glaring difference between them, but not enough that it would make it impossible for Luz to win. "Want to make a bet?" I asked Sandhu, half jokingly. He chuckled and said, "You know my luck's cursed. But I guess if we don't make it out alive, then my debt's null anyway." Luz was more of a defensive combatant, so it wasn't surprising when Wireheads initiated the conflict. He twirled his bat around. It still had the remnants of guard flesh clinging onto it. He did so in a near-mocking fashion at Luz. He was a delinquent after all. Luz hardly reacted, of course. That's just the way that he was. In response, he stepped forward, electricity flickering through his hands and up his forearms. Wirehead followed suit, unleashing a big swing at Luz's head, which he managed to intercept with one of his forearms. Nevertheless, the wires still pierced his skin. Wirehead followed up with a headbutt. This time, it connected with the flesh side of Luz's face, slicing him up rather gruesomely. But despite his seemingly grievous injuries, he remained unwavering. That was the thing about Luz. He was incapable of feeling any pain. Like I said, his exact origins remain a mystery. But the one thing that we did know about him for sure was the fact that he hailed from some kind of ancient clan residing in the Arctic Circle. In fact, he was the sole survivor of an incident that decimated his village, and he was hungry for revenge against the unknown force that had done that. After taking the headbutt, Luz was now in striking range. He formed his fingers into an arrow shape and drove them into Wirehead's solar plexus before electrocuting his insides. Wirehead quaked in pain as he swung his bat in a frenzied rage, just about demolishing Luz's ribcage. There was no reaction from him, though. Instead, he took his other hand and wrapped it around Wirehead's neck. Any normal person would have succumbed to Luz's electrical shocks after a few seconds. But of course, Wirehead was no normal person. Despite blood pouring out of the chest wound and skin on his neck beginning to bubble, he picked up Luz by the torso and slammed him over the steel railing. He broke his back. Even without sound, the mental audio of a spine snapping reverberated throughout my mind. Unsurprisingly, Luz didn't bat an eye. Wirehead went in for the kill, tossing Luz's body onto the ground before smashing it until it resembled nothing more than a mess of bloody pulp and broken bones. But somehow, he was still alive. Among the gruesome pile, I could see an eye blink. Once Wirehead had exhausted himself from his relentless swinging, Luz took his chance. Using his one arm that hadn't been smashed to bits, he crawled over and grabbed Wirehead by the foot before scaling himself up to his neck. Once there, he drilled his fist into Wirehead's forehead, utterly shredding his own hand in the process. In the end, it was worth the sacrifice. He was able to electrocute Wirehead's brain, finally causing the behemoth to drop. "So, I guess I won," Sandu said. "I guess," I said. I had my own reservations about calling Luz's performance a victory. By the end of it, all of his limbs and his spine had been shattered, and not an inch of his body wasn't hosting a series of deep cuts. The good side of his face had also been chipped away to the skull, leaving only his eye and half of his nose intact. And yet, he didn't move with any hint of desperation or concern, calmly crawling away from the scene using his one mangled hand. I could still see the current flowing through it as well, a telltale sign that he was ready to pick another fight. "Nice comeback victory," Sandu said. "I don't see him making it far though. Not as a tornado tier." "Yeah, but we made all of that up. It's not like it means anything," I responded. Truth be told, I was nearly rooting for Luz at the end there. Something about his resilience resonated with me, as bizarre as it may seem. I scanned the rest of the monitors. While Wirehead and Luz had been squaring off, the undead Nazi had burnt Diaxic to a crisp. On another monitor, Morgie was playing around with a void corpse that I recognized as Death Shadow. That one had chosen his own name. "3 down," I muttered to myself. "We have a big one coming up," Sandu announced. I followed his eyes to a monitor near the bottom of the room. He was right, this one was going to be good. Standing at opposite sides of the kitchen were Trench, 6'3", 330 pounds, and in the other corner, Sinju. He was 5'10", 148 pounds. Trench was a silent entity, dressed entirely in ancient-looking deep-sea diving gear, except for the head, which remained without a helmet. However, you couldn't get a glimpse of its face regardless. That was due to the fact that his features were completely distorted. So much so that if you tried focusing on the details, all you were going to get was a nasty migraine. On top of that, he was invisible in person. Let me explain. If he were standing right in front of you, you wouldn't be able to see him. The only way to get a glimpse of him was through secondary means, meaning cameras, mirrors, etc. This made him all the more dangerous. As for how he killed people, it was either by brute force using his monstrous strength, or by using his death aura, as us guards had dubbed it. Similar to Diaxic's zone. Once you were in his close vicinity, you would feel an astronomical amount of pressure and get crushed on the spot, comparable to what you would feel standing at the bottom of the ocean. But that's only if Trench wills it. Sometimes he'll turn the aura off and simply punch someone's head off. For that reason, he was in the mid-hurricane tier. As for Sinju, well, he was basically a psychotic, demon-possessed martial artist with supernatural levels of speed, strength, and agility. He had apparently trained in the Wraith style, or the technique beyond human comprehension, whatever that was supposed to mean. When he gets serious, his eyes will roll into the back of his head and black veins will begin to bulge out from underneath his skin. At that point, he'll be moving so fast that his motions become impossible to keep up with visually. And a single punch from him will be enough to completely vaporize a human head. But in all honesty, he's one of the least malicious voids out of the bunch. If you're weak, like us guards, he won't even spare you a glance. Granted that you stay out of his way. The only thing that he's really looking for are strong opponents to fight. But when he can't find one, he starts to get antsy. And that's when the problems begin to emerge. We've pegged him at a low hurricane level. Can Sinju even see Trench? Sandu asked. I guess so, I responded. The question was worth asking, but I wouldn't have been surprised if Trench's aura/invisibility simply didn't work on him at all. That seemed to be the case since Sinju decided to strike first. He rushed forward at an unfathomable speed, directing what must have been hundreds of strikes in succession at Trench. However, none of them fazed the obscure diver. I could see Sinju's lips curling into a psychotic grin at that fact. He had certainly found what he was looking for. The floor beneath him cracked as his eyes turned white and his grotesque veins began bulging. We couldn't see his strikes before, and now it was beyond impossible. He rushed forward, unleashing a maelstrom of lightning-like punches, elbows, and kicks against Trench. This went on for about 5 seconds before he was stopped in his tracks. Trench had grabbed him by the throat, still not looking any worse for wear in the process. I could see Sinju mouth something to the effect of, "What the?" before he was tossed into a metal fridge. It certainly appeared as if Trench was too much of a tank for him to handle. Nevertheless, Sinju got back up and cracked his shoulder into place while blood leaked from his mouth. And then he seemed to let out a shriek. He's crazy, I thought to myself. What did it take for somebody to become like this? At that point, he'd seemingly given up on technique entirely. Instead, he grabbed a handful of kitchen knives and began chucking them at Trench. While none of them pierced the suit, one of them managed to stick into the distorted head, which evidently dealt some damage. Trench flinched before taking the knife out and throwing it back at Sinju, who caught it effortlessly. At this point, Sinju was howling in what I assumed was some kind of sadomasochistic jubilation. He had found the weak point. Sinju rushed back at Trench, knife in hand, before slashing away at its face. Spurts of vicious, dark blue blood stained the kitchen floor, along with Sinju's own face. Soon enough, the knife snapped, and Trench threw a desperation punch at Sinju's temple. Sinju managed to block it with his forearm, although I could see his bones cracking from the impact. He leapt back, his arm hanging limp to his side, and dodged a follow-up haymaker. Throughout everything, a grin remained plastered on his face. His veins were bulging out so hard that I found it hard to believe that they weren't going to completely burst altogether. With one arm, Sinju lifted up a metal table and swung it into the side of Trench's head, nearly taking it off in the process. He wasted no time, grabbing a large frying pan and pouncing at his incapacitated opponent, knocking them both over in the process. He then took a position atop of Trench's body and furiously began slamming the pan into his face. "Martial arts, eh?" I could hear Sandu mutter. After what must have been 250 blows, the pan broke. On the ground, Trench's head had been obliterated no less than 50 strikes prior. Sinju tossed the scrap metal aside and looked up at the ceiling, presumably screaming, his lungs sore in sheer combative delight. Well, it looks like our tier system means nothing, I said. Despite the morbid scene unfolding in front of us, Sandu shared a laugh with me. We were at the point where the absolute absurdity and danger of the situation was beginning to fade from our senses. Heck, I suppose we were enjoying ourselves, as messed up as that may sound. We kept watching as Senju got up and stumbled around. Evidently, he was disorientated from both his injuries and the successive fits of fighting spirit-induced rage euphoria. He took about 4 steps before his head exploded, throwing the two of us watching it for quite the loop. Another figure stepped into the frame, whom we recognized as Satanbot. 6'11", 535 pounds. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine upon seeing him. It somewhat snapped me back into reality. Despite his comical name, Satanbot had to be one of the most frightening voids out there. I couldn't really understand what he was supposed to be. His body appeared to be robotic, but it moved in ways that were too fluid for even the most sophisticated android. Like he was made of legitimate metal flesh. It was honestly maddening to look at. On top of that, he literally resembled the devil himself. Reddish black scaly skin / metal shell. He had a mouth full of exposed razor-like teeth, rectangular slanted crimson eyes, a pair of large mechanical wings, and a long tail ending in something that resembled a 3-pronged spear to boot. For whatever reason, he also had a rocket launcher atop his right shoulder and a Gatling gun connected to his left hand. No, these were not mechanical modifications. They were literally connected to his body. He was unanimously considered one of the most dangerous voids residing in the chasm. He was rated at a high earthquake level. Even if Senju was at his full strength, he wouldn't have stood a chance. "Oh crap," Sandu commented. "I was hoping that he didn't escape." "Well, let's not worry about him for now," I said, turning my attention to another monitor. What my eyes landed on next was an utter massacre. Sitting atop a pile of guard bodies that must have eclipsed 6 feet was Hugo Wright, aka the Brutal Bishop, 6'2", 200 pounds. Like his name indicated, he was dressed in a traditional vicar-priest outfit. The only difference was the fact that the cross he wore around his neck was fashioned out of blades. The man himself had long, sweeping black hair and about 14 bags under both of his dead blue eyes. It was unclear to us what his real motivations were. It's not like he really followed the rules of any religion on Earth, despite his outfit. He just went on long rants about the sin of natalism and the futility of existence, and how to reach a state of sanctity, we must first reach a clean state. Basically, he wanted to kill every sentient being on Earth and then himself. And he wasn't all talk either. He was certainly strong. We rated him at a low hurricane level. After praying to whatever messed up deity he worshipped atop his pile of corpses, he slid down and began stalking the corridors for some more victims to fulfill his holy objective. Who he came across couldn't have been more perfect. Kaal Silva, aka Vampire Cop, 5'9", 176 pounds. Kyle was rather interesting, being that he was one of the most cooperative voids. In fact, he was the only prisoner that willingly turned himself in. His backstory was interesting as well, and one of the few that we actually knew about. He used to be a prolific, merciless Brazilian cop who patrolled the most dangerous parts of Rio. He was so good at it, so much so that he earned a reputation amongst the criminal underground as the Reaper. But he was still only human. During one fateful mission, his entire unit was massacred during an ambush by about a dozen distinct gangs. They had all unified under one goal of taking him down. He was the only survivor, but was captured in the process. After being brutally tortured in a warehouse for about 5 hours, the lights suddenly went out. During this period of darkness, the only sounds entering his ears were those of carnage. Every single gang member was obliterated by some unknown force. At the end of the bloodbath, he could hear footsteps slowly approaching him before a deep, raspy voice whispered something into his ear. "There's potential in you. Allow me to bestow you with an opportunity." He felt a sharp pain hit his neck before the hidden entity spoke to him again. "Fulfill your duty." And then he passed out. When he woke up, he found himself in his bed with all the wounds from his torture session just about healed. All the wounds except for one, a bite mark on his neck. His appearance had also drastically changed. Pale skin, dark eyes, and fangs. He had heard about the stories, but he could hardly comprehend that he had become one himself. While he couldn't handle being exposed to the sun anymore, he found that he now had superhuman strength and regeneration, which he used to brutalize criminals at night as a vigilante. However, it didn't take long for him to go too far. One night, he went into a frenzy, breaking into a house of a suspected rapist and killing everyone inside. Everyone, including the rapist's innocent mother and daughter. His resolve in regards to justice had never wavered, remaining strong no matter what he went through. For that reason, he could hardly live with the guilt on his conscience, and he walked to the police station that he used to work at, turning himself in to his former colleagues that all thought that he was dead. Of course, the news spread quickly. That's when the CIA stepped in and then transferred him over to the chasm. He put up no resistance. In fact, he deemed the chasm a place where he 100% belonged. Safe to say, he was a rather bizarre case. We put his strength at low hurricane level, the same as Hugo. On the monitor, I could see Kael's lips moving. Wanting to hear what he said, I began looking around to see if I could get some audio. It didn't take too long for me to find the volume control panel, which was located right under the middle desk. Thankfully, whoever set up this weird place took the liberty of labeling each switch with its respective monitor. I turned the volume up right in the middle of Kael's spiel. "Dangerous scum, I'm going to have to dispose of you all before it's too late." Hugo's face remained expressionless. "Scum, an apt description of the ones residing in this place. But I understand you are also a man wrought with unforgivable sin. I'll treat you no differently," he responded. Kael chuckled. "I wouldn't expect you not to." He took a provocative fighting stance and said, "Come on, let's settle this." Hugo put a hand on his blade cross before muttering another prayer to himself. He looked up at Kael, his eyes now a deep crimson. "The atrocities that I commit are in the pursuit of ultimate holiness. I hope that you can understand that." Kael grinned. "Yeah, I get it. Crazy people are crazy." As he finished the sentence, he rushed forward in a quick blur, sinking his fangs deep into Hugo's neck. In turn, Hugo grabbed Kael's head and twisted, snapping his neck in what had to be the most gruesome manner feasible, before plunging his fist into his chest. For the first time, Hugo grimaced. "What's wrong with your heart?" the priest asked before retracting his hand, revealing severe burn marks. Kyle twisted his head back into place before shooting Hugo a bloody grin. "I couldn't tell you, buddy." They traded blows for a few more minutes, pummeling each other into oblivion. While KL was certainly more skilled and had more tools at his disposal, Hugo possessed more raw power. Eventually, it all came to a standstill. KL had suffered upwards of 20 fatal injuries, forcing his regeneration abilities to the brink. Hugo was bleeding all over, had about 6 bone fractures, an eye gouged out and an ear ripped off. "You're pretty annoying, aren't you?" KL rasped out. Hugo bent over, coughing up large mouthfuls of blood. "Likewise." In the meantime, their confrontation had drawn an audience. Coming in from an intersecting corridor was Infernal Gladiator. He was 6'7", 285 pounds. He was rated at high hurricane level. Imagine an extremely buff zombie that was also perpetually burning, clad in ancient gladiator gear. That was him. In one of his hands, he gripped a gigantic flaming sword. In his other, he held 2 leashes, both holding respective voids at the neck, crawling at his feet like dogs straight out of hell. One was the freak, 6'10", 235 pounds. He was a slouching humanoid monster with strange flickering eyes and a grin that wrapped around his entire head. The other was the humanish centipede, 6'4", 372 pounds. He was a centipede-like creature that had a vaguely human face covered in 6 eyes, with an iron muzzle obscuring the mouth area. It crawled on 10 colossal veiny arms. They were both mid-tornado tier, not incredibly powerful. They were merely simple, aggressive beasts that possessed nothing but primal bloodlust and strength that was comparable to 3 wild bears put together. For that reason, they were easily converted into disposable weapons by the much stronger and more intelligent gladiator. KL cursed upon seeing the trio. "That's disgusting," he said. "Bloody abominations," Hugo added. "Nothing but creatures that stain this earth." They both looked at each other and nodded. An explicit sense of mutual understanding passed between them. I suppose that a few of the voids teaming up should have been inevitable. "Oh boy, this is heating up," I said with a laugh, turning towards Sandu. He didn't respond at first, instead looking as if he were trying to focus on something that wasn't on the screen. "What's the matter?" I asked him. I think there might be somebody else in here. Don't turn around. Just keep watching. Pretend like you didn't hear it," he replied, hardly above a whisper. It's not like I had to pretend. Hear what? I thought to myself. Nevertheless, I had never heard Sandu more serious. I turned my attention back to the monitors while forcing my ears to be alert. About 10 seconds later, I heard it. It was soft for sure. I wasn't surprised that I hadn't noticed it up until that point. Somewhere in the darkness behind us, somebody was definitely trying to contain a giggle.